I'm the greetings. My name is Susan Elkhorn, and I'm the forum coordinator for today. I'm a member of the forum committee, and I want to welcome you to our discussion today, both virtually and in person. Our Unitarian Universalist congregation organizes these forums as a service to the community, to support social action, and to encourage individual and collective growth for all of us. The title of today's forum is Constitutional Crisis, Insurrection, or Democracy in 2024. Given the current events and polarization we're experiencing right now, our plans and actions for the 2024 election definitely matter. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to mention our appreciation for the fact that NOVA, Northeast Ohio Voter Advocates, is co-sponsoring this forum. NOVA's mission is to increase voter turnout in the underserved areas of Cleveland and in Northeast Ohio. We have two speakers today, and I'd like to introduce our first one, Dr. Cherie. Dr. Strachan is a professor of political science at Akron University and director of the Bliss Institute of Applied Politics. She's done lots of research on political leadership, voter turnout, party polarization, and as well as the Me Too movement. Dr. Strachan is co-author of the textbook, Why Don't Women Rule the World? Understanding women's civic and political choices. Dr. Strachan.
Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to say I'm so happy to have a chance to connect with the community. I started my position as director of the Bliss Institute in July. So I've really only been here for a short while. I did my master's degree at the University of Akron in the 90s, but that's been a minute. So it's really good. I was just thrilled to be able to reconnect and learn my way around and find some of the organizations doing some civic engagement work. So I'm really happy to be here. I also, as Susan just mentioned, I do a good deal of my research is focused on polarization and incivility. And so if you have questions about sort of how we wound up here, I'll save those for question and answer. But I teach a whole class on how we wound up to be in this polarized position, or why we wound up with, at least until the last couple of election cycles, such low levels of participation. But what I wanted to drill down in and focus on is, given the topic for today and that I have about 10 minutes, is what are the implications of the 2022 midterms? What does that tell us as we look forward into 2024? And how does that position those who are thinking about pushing back against the backsliding democracy or illiberal trends toward illiberal democracy? So I'm sure we've all paid attention to the media reports. We know that 2022 put those who want to push back against the far right caucus of the Republican Party in a much better position than they had anticipated, right? That we know from the media reports that there was an anticipation of a red wave, that sort of the historical trends of midterms, typically what we see is losing seats in Congress from the president's party, losing state legislatures seats, and losing governorships. It's sort of Americans tend to not like dramatic changes in public policy or to be cautious. And so if the president has controlled Congress and done active things, we typically see some pushback or some, wait, maybe let us think about that for a second and maybe we should slow that down. And so historically in midterms, we would have anticipated a red wave. That is absolutely not what happened, and it's sort of a historical anomaly. So why did that happen, and how does that position us for 2024? Well, one of the things I think that's happened is that the demographic shift that we anticipated that creates an electorate that is a bit more in the Democrats' favor is coming to fruition sooner than demographers anticipated. So if you recall, back in 2010, there was a red wave. Republicans thought that they would leverage that popularity and that they would be successful in 2012 and in the national election. And they thought Mitt Romney had a serious shot at becoming president and didn't, and got crushed, if we all can kind of remember back 10 years ago. And so they were overconfident. And then when he didn't win and failed to pull together a national coalition, they did an autopsy report, which has since been released to the public. And the autopsy report was, if the Republican Party wanted to continue to be able to be viable at the national level and build a national coalition, right, given the demographic trends that we're facing the country in 20 years, so we're about halfway there for what they were sort of predicting, that they needed to be a center-right party, right? They needed to shift and become more moderate, or they were not going to be able to recruit voters the way they wanted to win national elections. And there's a number of demographic shifts that they were looking at and sort of plotting them out and saying, in 20 years, these are going to come to fruition and they're going to be a problem. One was that younger voters were shifting, right, even more to the Democratic Party and on those culture war issues. These were not going to be things that would be able to divide people and pull them to the Republican side anymore. So the culture war issues were just not having play with young voters. We know that the economic issues already didn't have play with young voters. And so that as those young voters became middle-aged and more likely to vote, this was going to be a problem. The other issue was that the country was becoming more diverse. We have an uptick in Hispanic voters, not because necessarily even from immigration, but from second and third generation voters and families that are already here, right? And so, people who are born here happen to be more Hispanic, right, over the next couple of decades, not because of open immigration policies. And then finally, women. Women, especially when women are educated, employed, and single, tend to vote for Democrats. And those are all trends just given all sorts of issues with access to education, limitations on access to childcare, concerns over needing to establish your career first if you're going to go and get an education. Women are delaying marriage. And that's been a long-term demographic trend that's just going to keep coming to fruition. And so the advice back in 2012 was become more moderate, develop a conservative plan for undocumented residents in the United States, stop making Hispanics mad and angry by using inflammatory language, and stop making women angry, or you will not be viable 20 years from now. Well, okay, so we know what's happened since then. We're halfway there to their prediction of a broader electorate that's more supportive of the Democratic Party. And instead of listening to that advice, which I think probably frustrates a lot of elites in the party, instead of listening to that advice, the base of the party that votes in the primaries ignored all of it and doubled down on Donald Trump and the MAGA wing of the party, and actually increased the number of registered voters, right, by putting Donald Trump forward, who would push back against that advice. And so the far right branch of the Republican Party took over in big ways. They already had control at the state level because of 2010's red wave. And so the policies that we see coming out of the state legislatures was alienating to the kind of demographic groups that I just described. And then it became much more visible at the national level because of the Trump administration. Probably the most dramatically visible, right, is the Dobbs decision and the changes with Roe v. Wade and access to reproductive health care. And so coordinated and organized pushback and mobilizing people specifically to push back has made that demographic shift in what would have probably happened more naturally anyways. There was a concerted effort to mobilize people to push back. So we've seen more pushback against and more mobilization of coalitions that are likely to vote Democratic than we would have seen without Dobbs, for example. And so that pushback starts to escalate. And we've seen a national coalition come together to push back 3 times, right? In the first midterm election with the Trump administration, with the presidential election that elected Biden, and then with the most recent 22 election, we see politicians that want to push back, community organizations that want to push back, building a coalition of people who have agreed to disagree on a lot of things in order to push back against the far right policies of that particular division of the Republican Party. And so we immediately see that with the Women's March, which wasn't just a march. People went home from that march with an understanding that they needed to step into leadership roles, start registering people to vote, build up the civic infrastructure back in the states and localities so that they could turn people out. So we build the civic infrastructure out of the Women's March. Millennials who are now approaching middle age, so typically as people age and hit those milestones, there's a tendency for people to become at least slightly more conservative or shift more toward conservative policies. That's not happening, right? So millennials are maintaining their identity as liberals and or Democrats, and they're still turning out to vote. Gen Z, even more so, right? The trends that we see with millennials being shaped by these politics are exacerbated with Gen Z, which are my college students right now. So college students right now turned out nationwide in the last midterm at the highest rate that we've seen in decades. It was only 27%, but for 18 to 29-year-olds who might not have a static address or are highly mobile, haven't hit some of those adult milestones yet, we haven't seen that high. They slightly outperformed that in 2018, but we haven't seen those levels in a really long time. They broke 63% for Democrats. Young women, 18 to 29-year-old young women, 72% in this midterm voted for Democrats, and 44% of young people identify as liberal. I mean, developing and identifying yourself with an ideology is pretty rare in the United States. So the fact that 44% of young women are doing that is a big deal. And then there were also a small percentage of disaffected Republicans and independents who actually broke ranks and voted for Democrats in this election, right? Sort of the never Trumpers actually sort of came to fruition in this midterm. And we see that affecting compromised speakers in the state legislatures in Ohio and Pennsylvania as a result of that coalition, giving Republicans someone else to coordinate their efforts with. We saw that Democrats overperform not just for those state national elections, but they didn't lose legislative seats in the state legislatures either. They picked up, they lost one governorship and picked up 2 other ones. So we actually have 2 more Democratic governors, much deeper bench. This was not the 2010 red wave where people were looking around to say, where is the talent pool coming from? Or where are people gonna learn the ropes? Where will the challenges from attorney generals come from at the state level if they don't like national policy? And I think that'll just continue. The policy trends, the reproductive rights issues playing out at the state level, Republicans taking back control of the House and some of the legislation they're trying to pass just means all of those things are just going to continue to build and foment and influence 2024. People will be willing to be mobilized in 2024. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I would now like to introduce Dr. Jonathan Entin. He's a law professor emeritus at Case Western Reserve University and an adjunct professor of political science. As a legal scholar of constitutional law, he's been active in public policy, social reform issues, and civil rights. His legal work and research have appeared in more than 100 articles, book, chapters, essays, and reviews. Early in his career, he clerked for Ruth Bader Ginsburg before she joined the Supreme Court. Dr. Entin is passionate about the U.S. Constitution and what we can do to pave the way for an equitable, stable 2024 election.
Thanks, Susan. First, I'm delighted to be here. I'm also delighted to meet Cherie Strachan. I've had some connections with the Bliss Center and the folks at Akron, so it's great to meet her in person. Just for the record, one small correction, Susan. Dr. Entin was my father. He was making house calls in his 80s. Now, I'm going to talk briefly about some legal issues that might bear on the 2024 election, and then we can try to think about how that relates to some of the things that Professor Strachan was talking about. We know from the aftermath of the last presidential election that there were lots of efforts to overturn the results. And some of those efforts reflected gaps and ambiguities in a 19th century statute called the Electoral Count Act. The Electoral Count Act was adopted in 1887 in the aftermath of the contested election of 1876, which resulted in an Ohioan getting elected president, Rutherford Hayes, even though he did not win the popular vote, and New York Governor Samuel Tilden, who did win the popular vote, also was one vote short of a majority in the Electoral College. A special commission was appointed, awarded all of the outstanding disputed electoral votes to Hayes, and that's how he got elected. And after the 2020 election, President Trump and his advisors claimed that various provisions, or more to the point, various ambiguities in the Electoral Count Act allowed the vice president to resolve disputes over electoral votes. You'll remember that was a controversial claim, one that the vice president rejected, and that's why people wanted to hang Mike Pence. Another aspect of this statute was that there was a pretty low threshold for objecting to a state's electoral vote. It required one senator and one representative, and so it was not too difficult to get objections to be raised. Now, in the wake of that, a bipartisan group of senators worked on some revisions to the Electoral Count Act that were ultimately incorporated into the Consolidated Appropriations Bill, that $1.7 trillion bill that you heard getting denounced so much during the 15 ballots for the House Speaker. So let's take a look at some of the things that those changes did. Now, first, the amended Electoral Count Act makes clear that there is only one proper slate of electoral votes from each state, and it is the slate that is certified by the governor, or in some states, maybe the Secretary of State. But that's the only slate that can be accepted. So the idea of having a rump group of electors get together on the day of the Electoral College meetings and send those off to Congress and supposedly letting the vice president decide which one to accept. That won't happen under the amended Electoral Count Act. Second, the amended act provides for expedited judicial review of any legal challenges to the electoral votes in a state, and limits the potential plaintiffs in such cases to presidential or vice presidential candidates. And so, for example, this effort by Texas to challenge the electoral votes of Georgia and Arizona and Michigan and Wisconsin, I mean, that didn't go anywhere anyway, but that sort of case could not be brought under the amended Electoral Count Act. Third, now Congress is required to accept only the electoral votes that are certified by the governor or secretary of state. Or if it turns out that there is a successful lawsuit and there's a court order, that's the slate of electoral votes that has to be accepted. There's no discretion built into the process. And that further means that the vice president has only a ministerial role. That is, the vice president sits up on the podium and presides, but the vice president doesn't get to make independent decisions about which votes to count. Now, the other thing, another thing that's important here, the threshold for filing, for making an objection has been raised substantially. Instead of one senator and one representative, it is now 20% of the House and 20% of the Senate. So that means if there are no vacancies, 20 senators and 87 representatives. I'm not sure that there were 87 representatives prepared to object in 2020. And even if there were, it would have been it still would have been a more complicated sort of arrangement. Not only is the threshold for filing objections or for making objections much higher in terms of the numbers, the grounds for an objection are also strictly limited. That either the electors were not properly certified by the appropriate state official, or that at least one of a state's electors did not properly vote. So the idea that you can object because somehow the state election officials deviated from state law or allegedly deviated from state law, which was essentially the objection in places like Pennsylvania last time, that sort of objection would not even be accepted, even if there were lots of senators and representatives who were prepared to make it. And perhaps most important, the amended Electoral Count Act makes clear that the ground rules for how the state's electoral votes are going to be cast and counted, the ground rules have to be in place before Election Day. That's important because that would prevent, say, the state legislature, and there were efforts to do this last time in several states, it would prevent the state legislature from saying, well, even though the popular vote in our state went for candidate A, we want the votes to go to candidate B. So that is not supposed to happen under the amended statutes. Now, let's be clear. The stakes in a presidential election are sufficiently high that there will be smart, creative people looking for loopholes to see what they can do to exploit the system. But these changes to the Electoral Count Act make it much less likely that there will be loopholes to exploit. Now, I just want to take a minute or two to talk briefly about one other potentially important legal issue that could bear on the next set of elections. And those issues all one way or another deal with districting, which those of us in Ohio are very familiar with. Now, the cases that are pending right now involve something called the independent state legislature theory. the Article 2 of the Constitution says that each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct presidential electors. Well, the changes to the Electoral Count Act will limit what state legislatures can do with electors. But there is another aspect of the independent state legislature theory, and the Supreme Court is going to be dealing with that this term. In Article 1, we have an elections clause that says that the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. That's the same language as we have with respect to the presidential selection. Now, there is a case up there now that was argued in early December called Moore against Harper. That's a North Carolina case. It involves a congressional map that the state Supreme Court rejected as a partisan gerrymander that violated the state constitution. The Republican legislative leaders who were responsible for this map have taken this case to the Supreme Court, and they are arguing a strong form of the independent state legislature theory. That is to say that the state courts and state law have no role. The state legislature gets to do whatever it feels like. Now, if this sounds familiar, the second case that is sitting up there in the Supreme Court, and then is almost certainly going to be held for decision based on the North Carolina ruling, is from Ohio relating to the congressional maps. And again, the Republican members of the redistricting commission are arguing, at least in part, the strong form of the independent state legislature theory, because after all, the Ohio Supreme Court rejected the congressional maps on the basis of the state constitution. Now, as I said, the case was argued in early December. Although 4 justices previously had expressed some sympathy for this theory, it seems that only 3 of the justices were comfortable with the strongest form of the theory, but 3 other justices seem to be open to the possibility that there might be federal limits on what state courts could do. We won't have a ruling on this probably until June, but that could make a difference to how the congressional maps may look going forward, especially in states like North Carolina and Ohio, where they're still in legal dispute. And who winds up getting elected from on these basis of these maps could make a large difference in terms of what the government does. Now, there's plenty more to say, but let me stop here so that we can carry on.
All right. Thank you both for your excellent presentations. It is now time for questions and answers. And if you're here and have a question or comment, raise your hand and we will get to you. If you're with us virtually, please look at the Q&A button on your screen and click on it. And if your question is chosen, we will use your first name unless you hit the anonymous button. I have one more thought here. We will be circulating a clipboard. And if you want to receive upcoming announcements of our forums, simply add your name and email address. And if you're online and want to receive, upcoming announcements of our forums, simply go to the chat box and put your name and address in the chat box, and we'll see that you get on our list. So that's it. We're ready for questions and answers.
Thank you. I guess I'll stand up.
Close.
I'm sorry.
The audience wants to hear you.
Okay, can you hear me? I actually have a couple of questions, but I don't want to hog. My first question is to Dr. Strachan. The evidence seems to point to me
Even closer.
in another direction. The demographics seem to according to you, favor a more blue wave in the future. But we live, for example, in a state that used to be bellwether. You had to win Ohio to win the country. The winner always, almost always, save for two elections in the previous century, had to win Ohio. Kennedy was an exception. Now Trump is an exception. Now Ohio is solidly red. The candidate for Senate actually was a blue collar worker. He should have been able to carry the state, I would think. The swing state in 2000 was Florida, and now that's solidly Republican. So the political landscape doesn't seem to be going that way. Can you explain? And where the Democrats are likely to find their electoral votes, since the blue wall of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan are now up for grabs. So what have they done to lose Ohio, then Florida, then the blue wall?
Sure. So one thing is that in terms of the trending demographics shifting blue, in terms of what the demographers, even for the Republican Party, predicted, we're still 10 years out, right? So what you saw in 2022 was a precursor, not what they fully, right? So eventually what you're gonna, if this comes to fruition, and demographics are not, that doesn't take into account messaging, polarization, social media, like all of the other things that can change. But they didn't anticipate this early, that there would be a shift toward the Democratic Party. We're still 10 years out. So if you think of who are the MAGA voters primarily, are older white men and their wives, and they're typically oftentimes women who identify with their male husband's career, economic status, like they were typically stay at home, not women who were in the workforce or had their own careers or stayed single for a long period of time. So that demographic group is going to continue to pass out of the political process. And what you're seeing is a really incredibly mobilized group of young, you're going to be replaced by angry young women, right? That's 44% of young women, 18 to 29-year-olds who are already identifying as liberal right out of the gate, aren't going anywhere. And right, so that as the demographics shift over the next 10 years, you'll see that, maybe come into more balance. And then Ohio's been losing young people, right? Rust Belt, Middle West states have been losing youth and young people. So our population is a little bit older than it used to be. That helps to explain some of the shift of why Ohio is a little bit more red than other places. And then there was another point I had in there somewhere. What's that? That's
Florida.
Florida. Yeah, I haven't been paying as much attention to why Florida, but you also see, for example, a lot of boomers moving to Florida after they retire. So potentially like the age and the demographics of who's moving to Florida and who's making up likely voters in the state of Florida, potentially having some play. And demographics aren't everything, right? This is we also see the Republican Party making serious plays for Hispanic voters. Hispanic voters aren't a monolith, right? So Mexican Americans tend to vote for Democrats, Venezuelans, Cubans in Florida tend to vote for Republicans because of their experiences with communism and populist socialism. So the fact that we did not have a traditionally historical midterm is speaking to those long-term demographic shifts coming to fruition a little bit earlier, not in Ohio.
Yeah, let me just add that I think it's important to recognize demography isn't destiny.
Right.
Even when we talk about the idea that 44% of younger women are identifying as liberal, that means that 56% of them are not, wherever they are politically. The other thing that we probably should keep in mind, especially in Ohio, is the extraordinary disorganization of the Democratic Party in this state. For the last 32 years, with the exception of Sherrod Brown, there have been almost no Democrats winning statewide elections, except for a handful of state Supreme Court candidates, and it's not clear how that will play out now that the general election for Supreme Court will be on a partisan ballot. But it is only partly a problem of gerrymandering that the Ohio legislature is overwhelmingly Republican. The Democratic Party has not done a very good job in recent years, even if there are larger social and economic trends that might have been unfavorable for this. So to some extent, we are talking about what the people who are engaged in politics are actually doing and how skillful they are. As I said, at least in this state, and I've been here almost 40 years now, at least in this state, it's not clear that the folks who are making decisions in the Democratic Party have been doing a great job of it.
I have a question over here with Mark, but I just want to make a comment first. My daughter was asked to run for a district that ended up not existing as a Democrat in the just east of Cleveland, and she had to raise $300,000 if she wanted to run, and she could get paper signed. She had no problem getting paper signed. When she did get her signed, no one wanted it, and the Democratic Party existing candidates all around her were attacking her because they were worried she was running against them. There's very little effort in the Democrats to like raise up new politicians, just as an example of why it's difficult to make changes. $300,000 for a young family to raise, that's crazy.
To both speakers, thank you for your remarks. So I wanted to bring up labor. We haven't talked about it, and by that I mean the labor movement, but also workers. And two things. One, will there be a time when the Democratic Party will do what it did in the 1940s and 50s? For example, campaign against right to work and against even the whole idea of Taft-Hartley and these types of laws. And then I think why this is important, I think, is because the defection of work, as you know better than I do, the defection of workers to the Republican Party around issues that in part are class issues, especially around how the type of work that they do is perceived. Thank you very much.
So it's interesting. I read an op-ed, and I'm blanking on the name right now, by another political scientist. So I apologize for plagiarizing that work without citing it. I'm not trying to plagiarize. I just can't remember the person's name right now. Arguing that that's why Fetterman did better, right, than Ryan. But Fetterman doubled down on progressivism, right? He looks the working class part and made the same attempt to go everywhere. And on image and having an effective and efficient campaign apparatus, the two were fairly well matched. But Fetterman doubled down on progressivism and mobilized more young people. And when the margins are that close, that could have made the difference for why Fetterman was so popular with young people and Gen Z, and Ryan in Ohio kind of fizzled a little bit in terms of turning young people out in the same way. It might be because the Democratic Party pulled money, right, and invested it in other places, and Ryan didn't have the same money to play with that Fetterman did. But it could also be that the messaging was really different. Ryan was, opposed, coming out and saying, like, I don't vote with Nancy Pelosi, and, don't label me as a progressive. And Fetterman was all in. Gen Z is the most supportive generation of labor unions and organizing that we've seen in decades, right? The public opinion polling is showing that they are ready to join unions. And, politicians are finger to the wind. And so if they see the next couple of election cycles in, as Gen Z continues to vote and make itself a voting bloc, and that's something that they want to see in politicians, and politicians have to respond in order to win elections, then I think that it's hard to have a crystal ball, but I could see it potentially moving more in that direction that it's been in a long time.
Let me just say something about Ryan. I mean, he lost, but unlike Fetterman, he was not facing the drift or the drag of a generally weak ticket. Ryan ran about 10 points ahead of the gubernatorial candidate, Nan Whaley. This is not a criticism of her. Mike DeWine was a strong candidate, but all of the Republican statewide office or candidates for statewide offices this year all ran well ahead of J.D. Vance. And if the Democratic Party in Ohio were stronger than it has been, then Ryan might well have pulled this off. I mean, it's not as though, for example, that Fetterman won by a landslide,
No,
right? If Ryan had been able to pull, say, 5 more percentage points, he would have had a fairly narrow victory. So, I mean, that's small consolation to Ryan in the sense that he lost. But this reflects, I think, the point I was making earlier about the longer term weakness of the Ohio Democratic Party.
and DeWine's no Mastriano.
Right.
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 People felt much more comfortable voting for DeWine.
Right.
Good morning. Once upon a time, the U.S. Supreme Court was considered an apolitical institution. Today, not so much. The justices are associated by the president who appoints him or her. Question is, in lieu of having the court enlarged with each successive administration, do you think there'd be any traction in having term limits of 18 years, the proposal of term limits for 18 years and a justice appointed each 2 years, so that you have rotating justices and persons occupying the court?
Well, a lot of people who are a lot smarter than I am have been advocating that. The devil is in the details. Under the Constitution, the justices essentially have life tenure. They're already there. And so it might be that a term limit system would improve things, but it's not like we're just going to get it like that. There's going to be a potentially long transition period. And even if we got there, and we got there fairly quickly, given the polarization of the parties, Professor Strachan knows these studies better than I do, but for some time now, the most conservative Democrat has been to the left of the most liberal Republican senator, right? Even though the confirmation process, the confirmation will still have to take place. And if you look at the way the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee treated Justice Jackson when she was there, when it was clear that her appointment was not going to change the center of gravity of the court, and they still hammered her. It's not clear that even a term limit system will necessarily defang the level of vitriol that we see in the confirmation process, and that will reinforce a lot of the notion that somehow the court is a really high stakes political institution. So I mean, it might be a step in the right direction, but it's certainly not going to resolve all of our issues.
I've studied this issue.
Wait, Mike.
Could I just make one?
You need a microphone.
There's a professor named Akhil Amar at Yale who has worked on this a great deal. And he came to realize that if you want to get this done, you need to try to have it done in Congress rather than through an amendment of the Constitution. Constitutional amendment process is so extraordinarily difficult that if it can be done in Congress, it's essential that that be explored. And the key to doing that is to say that this is not an idea that has to do with term limits. And the way he has rephrased it is that it's time limits, that the appointments are permanent, lifetime appointments as a justice of the Supreme Court, but that you serve only 18 years on the bench. And then you rotate to senior justice status, and actually in a complex way can come back for some service on the court.
Like Pope Emeritus?
It's exactly. It's like it's an emeritus status, senior justice status, but that would appear to address one of the fundamental issues. But you do. It's very hard to begin to think of this not as a term limits issue, but as a time limit to the service on the court, and then you have a possibility of action within Congress.
Well, with all respect to Professor Amar, whom I know and respect, how we get from here to there is really complicated. It is really difficult for me to envision, even if he's right, that Congress could do this by legislation. And lots of other smart people are not so sure. But even if he's right, you have to get Congress to do this. Republicans have no incentive to change the system because they have the advantage. And so that's why I don't want to say, I agree that the court is not in the best place for a variety of reasons, but I don't think that it's going to be very easy in the real world to get from where we are to someplace better.
Since we're talking wishful thinking about changing the Supreme Court, one other bit of wishful thinking. The whole electoral college and electoral process is clearly anti-democratic. We've had a handful of presidents elected, and this is likely to continue. Republicans against the vote of Vox Populi. Is there any chance, again, going back to wishful thinking, of getting rid of the electoral process and establishing a democratic election?
There are two possibilities that, at least if we want to think of logical options. One is a constitutional amendment. That's not going to happen. You need 38 states to ratify an amendment, and again, that's not going to happen. There is another option that is actually out there right now. It's called the National Popular Vote Compact. And the idea is that if enough states agree to this, or enough states with a sufficient number of electoral votes agree to this, that those states would commit to casting their electoral votes in favor of the winner of the national popular vote. Now, they're well short of the number of states they need at this point, and I haven't really looked at this in great detail, but I know that there are some legal questions about whether such an arrangement would pass constitutional muster. There is a provision in the Constitution allowing for interstate compacts, but compacts require congressional approval. There are, aside from the political question of would Congress approve, there are also, some folks have been raising questions about whether this is the sort of thing that could be done by compact. I don't have an answer to that, but that seems like the more promising option, but I can't give you a sense about the likelihood that it could succeed.
Another question.
Get the other gentleman here.
I don't many questions today.
I feel that democracy would work a lot better with education being
better in our country? I mean, as opposed to a nation of dummies voting, and as opposed to educated people. I mean, what could be done with education to help democracy?
I think that's, I mean, we required states, we required territories, right? That's how we got land grant universities. We required territories to have a plan for having universities in place and dedicating resources to it before we let them become states, because we have historically recognized that democracy requires an educated citizenry. So I am doing all that I can. I'm a member of there's a reform movement in higher education to try to remind our provosts and presidents of our civic mission. And so it's faculty and administrators across the country belong to, it's kind of it's trying to change higher education is like trying to shift a barge with an oar. But right, trying to go, hey, wait, we are supposed to not only be preparing people for careers and technology and, you know, all the things, but also for their role as citizens and finding ways. So about half of my research is about finding ways while we have students on a college campus to transform them into, you know, public spirited Tocquevillian kind of good citizens. And what are the, how do we backfill the loss and the erosion of natural political socialization that's taken place with at least the students that come to college? And then recognizing that not everyone goes to college, then those of us on college campuses that have teacher education programs, you know, try to work and find ways to, you know, backfill that training back into, I just consulted on a digital platform for civic education, re-embedding civics into 8th grade, right? Into 8th grade social studies. I mean, we've abandoned civic education. Yeah. Yeah.
I find it absolutely amazing what some people do not know. The older I get, I'm that way. Okay. For instance, the British royal family, everybody knows they're celebrities. And the moment the Queen died, I was getting HVAC stuff done on my house in Cleveland Heights, and I was on the second floor at my computer. And Queen died. I stepped up across the hall and to ask these guys a question or check how they were doing. I said, "Oh, if you're interested, the Queen died, Queen of England." One of them said he didn't know they had kings and queens anywhere in the world. So I agree. I think it's not just college people, because only about 35 or 40% start college and 33 or so or 5% finish. What about the other 65? And I think that from what I've heard, they've let civics go. When they have it, it's taught by somebody that's, I don't know, got another background to teach other academics. So,
well, and actually the most important experience is really memorizing road information is important, but really the most important experiences are the kind of things you do, as I've looked at your webpage, through, right, the congregation. The best predictor of long-term adult political participation is civic volunteerism. And so all of the clubs, groups, and organizations, not coached, not mentored, where the students have councils, use parliamentary procedure, make decisions, have a budget, and do think 4-H is a better, you know, we still need content, right? But they don't see the content as useful. They get the content. They don't remember it because it's not part of their intrinsic identity that that's supposed to be something that they're expected to do, which comes from interaction with your peers, expecting you to perform it. It's experiential. And for all sorts of reasons, I teach a whole class, come to Akron. For all sorts of reasons, there's been an erosion and a pulling back. So it's like the privatization of American life. We pull back into our individual pursuits, whether it's because we're working 80 hours a week, where was the question about the labor unions, or you know, a host of civic infrastructure in the United States up through the 1960s was racist and sexist. My husband's not going to be a Mason because they won't let me through the door, right? And so things didn't shift fast enough and change fast enough. So there's not only an erosion of formal instruction, but the kinds of experiences that students had where they cultivated that intrinsic identity and understood how to, the art of organizing, Tocqueville's art of organizing, is what we have to replace for our young people.
Not to hog, but my next question. My next question is to Dr. Entin. Because we have well-educated people who don't necessarily, in my opinion, can't be relied upon to support the democratic process. We've had the Secretary of State candidate in Arizona who is an election denier. I'm not so sure we don't have them on the Supreme Court now. Certainly spouses of them anyway. So what do we do when these people who are educated and part of the system do not necessarily have a commitment to our democratic system?
Well, one thing that we might take some solace from is that the election deniers who ran for office in Arizona all lost. Some of them lost by an uncomfortably narrow margin, but they did lose. To some extent, that's a condition of life, but to the extent that they overplay their hand, and I actually lived in Arizona for a couple of years. I, just for what it's worth, I actually knew Sandra Day O'Connor when she was a state legislator, and had occasion to talk to her a couple of times. I mean, and she today would be regarded as a dangerous radical by the folks who control the Arizona Republican Party organization. But it's not like we are in a uniquely bad place because we have election deniers in Arizona and some other places. I mean, if you go back, say, to the 40s and 50s and 60s, we had people who in big chunks of the United States who would not allow people of color to, Black folks and Latinos to vote, to go to the same schools, to work in the same places. It seems to me, and I'm not a Pollyanna, but it seems to me that we need to keep things in perspective. Michael Walzer has a wonderful book called Exodus and Revolution that he wrote about 30 years ago. And his point is that there's not a promised land, right? It's always a day-to-day struggle. You just face new issues. And so I don't know what to do about the Carrie Lakes or the Kelly Wards of the world. I know they're out there. But maybe if the rest of us are skillful, we can minimize their impact.
I would end on an optimistic note as well. I mean, I tell my students, and I think it's important to embed the civic learning and organizing at the kind of schools where I teach, right? So that, we can counter someone who's power hungry with an elite degree by the masses knowing how to organize, right? Nonviolent civil disobedience, the art of organizing labor unions, the art of organizing for civil rights and the kinds of policies and infrastructure that we want, and protection of individual rights that we want. And I tell my students, as long as you have the right of association, like we have frayed civic infrastructure. We have a loss of political and civic learning because our civic infrastructure and the organizations like this one that make it happen have atrophied over the past several decades. But we're not in Iran where people are getting killed for participating in a protest, right? We're not in places where it might be hard to found a labor union and to organize or to do some of this work, but we still can do it. And so put the emphasis on where we can put our energy, right? And to counteract the things that we don't like, because we can still do it. While you can still do it, do it.
Thank you so very much for being with us this morning. Shared with us this morning. We definitely do. I want to mention that this forum is being recorded, and you can download it by going to uucleveland.org at some point in the future, maybe later on this week. I do have some upcoming announcements. Next Sunday's forum at 9 o'clock is titled Food Insecurity, an Increasing Challenge. An estimated 225,000 people in Cuyahoga County lack adequate food resources. Julie Johnson, CEO of the Hunger Network, and Darcy Friedman, a professor of health and environmental science at Case, will be our speakers. And 2 weeks from today, on January 29th, we'll be discussing redlining and hospital closures. Our speakers include Dr. Sadir Al-Klandi, a cardiologist at University Hospitals, and Dr. Jim Boyle, a retired physician at St. Vincent Charity Hospital, which has recently closed. So redlining is an important issue for us to be more informed about. The sermon today, I'd like to invite all of you to it. It starts at 10:15, and we also are online virtually at UU Cleveland with our sermon. The title of today's sermon is The Courage to Face Our Fears. Dr. Randy Partain will discuss this issue and how we can step back and live more fully into our own life-affirming values. Thank you and very, very much for being with us this morning, and we'll see you next week at 9 o'clock. Thank you.